Hi, this is Matthew Cratter from Trader University, and today I want to answer the question, is inflation good or bad? If you're interested in learning how to make money in any financial environment, in a bull market or a bear market, be sure to hit that subscribe button. So this video is being made in response to JK on my Dow 100,000 video. He asked, I don't know if I like inflation or hate it. And this is a very good question. A lot of people are confused about inflation and deflation, so I thought I'd make a couple videos about it. Now, inflation affects different people in different ways. Inflation is basically your purchasing power goes down. And so if you have an equal amount of money, it will buy less stuff. So for example, in the 1950s, you could buy a house in Palo Alto, California for about $50,000. Now that same house is probably $3 or $4 million. So you can have inflation in the price of eggs and milk at the store. You can also have inflation at asset prices, stock prices, real estate prices, etc. But I'm going to stick with a very basic definition here. Basically, inflation is when your purchasing power goes down. When I was a kid, you could get a Big Mac for about 50 cents. Now it's closer to $5. That is inflation, both in labor costs and raw materials, beef, wheat, etc. So inflation affects different groups in different ways. If you owe money, if you're a debtor, inflation is good for you. And this is simply because you get to pay off your debt in devalued dollars, in dollars that are worth less than when you first borrowed them. So if you have a lot of debt, inflation is good. If you have a lot of savings, on the other hand, if you have a lot of cash, if you have wealth, that's the accumulation of your labor, inflation is bad for you. And this can be seen, it's sort of the mirror image of inflation being good for debtors. If you are a creditor, if you're a saver, you've basically not consumed the fruits of your labor. So you've had some revenue, you've had some income, you've had some expenses, you managed to put some money aside and save it after paying taxes. Now if you lend out your money and there's inflation or high inflation or hyperinflation, you get paid back in depreciated dollars. So if you loan someone $100,000, 10 years they pay you back, they pay you interest in the meantime. 10 years later, that $100,000 doesn't have as much purchasing power. So inflation is good if you owe a lot of money. Inflation is bad if you are owed a lot of money. So let's look at a couple examples. The classic example is someone who's retired. Maybe they have $100,000 in cash savings. They don't want to put it in the stock market. They don't want to put it in risky things because they want to make sure that they have enough money to last the rest of their life. So they're maybe sitting in a savings account right now, a high yield savings account. If they're making 1% or 1.5%, they're really, really lucky. They're probably making closer to 0%. In this case, inflation is really bad for you. Your purchasing power, let's say we have 2% inflation. Your purchasing power is going down every year. So after the first year with 2% inflation, your actual purchasing power is $98,000. You'll still have that $100,000 in your account, though of course you'll be drawing it down to pay your annual expenses, but the money that's left over will have less purchasing power. And so inflation, low interest rates, low real rates of return are very hard on people who are retired or on some sort of fixed income, on Social Security, on a pension, something like that. Especially given the fact this 2% inflation target is sort of a classic central bank target. I believe that real inflation is much higher than that. It's probably closer to 5 to 10%. And so you shouldn't believe the CPI index. I'm going to make some more videos on this as well. I have one video on it, but I'd like to sort of flesh it out and talk about how the CPI index is constructed. So basically, if you're living on fixed income, if you have cash, inflation is bad for you. Now let's say you're at the other end of the life cycle. You're a recent college graduate. Unfortunately, you had to take on a lot of student debt. But the good news about this is student debt is fairly low yielding. It's not like credit card debt, which has such a high rate of interest that it's very difficult to pay it off because it compounds against you so quickly. Student debt usually has lower interest rates. And so the nice thing about this is if there's inflation, you have the whole lifetime to pay off your debt. You make your monthly payments. And if there's inflation, the purchasing power of the dollar is going down over time. So let's say you owe $100,000 in student debt. By the time you pay that off after 10 or 20 years or whatever it is, that $100,000 will have a lot less purchasing power. Meantime, your wages will go up with inflation, hopefully, and so it's sort of a 1-2 punch that helps you out as your salary goes up and the value of your debt goes down in real terms because of inflation. So again, inflation really good for people who owe a lot of money and really bad for people who have a lot of money, especially if it's fiat money or cash. Now, let's think of an example where someone is sort of middle class, maybe working class, and they spend, let's say they spend 50% of their annual income on a house, on a rental, an apartment, something like this. Now, inflation could be good for this person or bad for this person if their wages keep up with inflation. In other words, if they get an annual inflation adjustment, maybe they get a 2% raise every year, and if inflation is really 2%, then they're keeping pace. Hopefully their rent is going up by 2% a year while their salary is going up by 2% a year, and there's sort of these two things net themselves out. Unfortunately, this is not how it's been working, at least in the US for the last 30 years. Working class salaries are very stagnant. They haven't been rising at the rate of inflation. Meanwhile, the Fed has been monetizing the debt, creating new money and purchasing assets, which drives up stock prices, drives up real estate prices. And so what's probably happening to this person is they're getting a 1 or 2% cost of living adjustment if they're lucky. Maybe they're not getting any. And the price of their rent is going up by 5, 10, 15% every single year. And so they're getting squeezed. And so inflation only works for you or is neutral if you're getting an adjustment on the income side and the expense side. And so if your apartment's going up 5% a year, you need to be getting a salary increase of at least 5% a year for those two things to net themselves out. And this is why buying a house is quite often recommended, because what you do is you usually take out a lot of debt. You take out a mortgage on a house, and maybe you put down 20%, you take out 80%. And the nice thing about having a big mortgage, and this is assuming you don't overpay for the house, you don't buy it at the peak of a housing bubble, and it's also assuming that you don't take on so much debt that you can't service it. If you stop making monthly payments, you'll lose the house, you'll lose your down payment, etc. But if everything works out, if you finance it conservatively, you buy in a good market that slowly ratchets up, what will happen is the value of your asset will go up, the value of the house will go up. Meanwhile, that mortgage debt will be deflated by inflation. So let's just say you borrow $100,000 to buy a house. After 30 years, when you eventually paid that off, you will have paid it back in dollars that are worth less due to inflation. And that's why this is historically been a very good trade to have, or a good investment to have, where you take out fixed, maybe it's a fixed rate mortgage, and you get to pay off your debt in devalued dollars. Now, where inflation starts to hurt people is it can really depend on whether your class as well, and there's no one rate of inflation for everyone. And so, let's say, for example, you're middle class, upper middle class. You want your kids to go to college. We can see that the rate of inflation in college tuition has gone up much, much more than the CPI index, than the regular rate of inflation. Wages haven't kept up with this. The same goes for health insurance, medical costs in general. If you're lucky, your employer pays your health insurance premiums. I'm self-employed, so I pay my own health insurance premiums, and they've just gone up an enormous amount over the last 10 years. So different people have different rates of inflation. And if you are competing for things that are relatively rare, like there are only so many Ivy League schools, there are only so many universities in general, and so if there's more demand than supply, there's a way in which that inflation rate can be much higher. And even if you're upper middle class, you're a software developer, or even in finance, these rates of inflation and tuition are crazy. And so if you choose to live that lifestyle, kind of keeping up with the Joneses, where you send your kids to private school or send them to a private college, or even the public colleges now have very high tuition, you can have a much higher rate of inflation than the increases you're getting in your salary. For example, there's very high inflation among the sort of things that wealthy people consume. So here's a typical family vacation offered by Stanford. I get these brochures in the mail, and here's a Galapagos family adventure. Sounds great. Take the kids. I have a wife and 3 kids, so there are 5 of us. And so we just scroll down and take a look at the price. Each adult will be $8,000. The kids are about $7,500 each. So call it $35,000-$40,000 for a 2-week trip to the, actually less than that, maybe 10-day trip to the Galapagos. So depending on your class or what you're aspiring to, you can have very high rates of inflation. Obviously, this is discretionary. This is not something that everyone needs. But there's been a lot of inflation in sort of high-end vacations, college tuition, medical costs, etc. Now, the sort of wealthy person version of buying a house, financing it with debt, would be this trade by Hugh Hendry, who's a famous hedge fund guy. He ran a Eclectical Macro hedge fund and retired a couple years ago. He lives on St. Bart's in the Caribbean, and his famous trade is called vol at the end of the world. This is very appropriate in the era of COVID, etc., where you want to be isolated and away from people. Now, St. Bart's is it's a bit of a tax haven. There's no income tax. Capital gains tax is just 25%. They have a lot of environmental regulations. It's a very strict housing supply. And so there's a built-in scarcity. And so what Hugh does is he really benefits from inflation and also benefits from being able to fund his asset purchases at a very low price to purchase scarce assets that continue to go up in price. There are only so many houses on St. Bart's. It's a limited supply of high-quality goods. In this way, it's a little bit like Bitcoin or gold or California real estate or Hawaii real estate, something like this, where it's very scarce. And so what he does is he takes out a loan in euros at 2% or less. He uses this to buy real estate on St. Bart's, and he sort of makes money from that spread. And he benefits from 2 kinds of inflation, sort of normal inflation as fiat money is devalued, and also this kind of inflation where really wealthy people, centimillionaires and billionaires, get more and more rich. They're looking for tax havens. And so there are only so many nice islands in the Caribbean and that are tax havens. And so he's sort of benefiting at both ends here. And so this is a good trade. Unfortunately, most people cannot borrow at 2% or less for 20 years. If you're a company, you might be able to. If you're a central bank or a bank, you certainly can. Or if you're a very high net worth individual like Hugh Hendry presumably is, you can do it. But this is a very smart way of taking advantage of inflation. So if you're able to do this, if you're able to borrow at very low rates and use that to fund the purchase of scarce assets and do it in a safe way where you can continue to, maybe he rents these out, I don't know. If you can do it in such a way that you can continue to make your monthly payments on the debt, this is one way to really benefit from the world blowing up from COVID or from very high inflation rates, because he's basically locked in here at 2% a year. And so if his real estate goes up by just 2%, he's doing very well. And obviously it starts to compound as well. He's long an asset, he's short a liability. And so this is an interesting trade. It's not something that everyone can do. But this would be an example of someone who is a saver, who's a creditor. Presumably his net worth is positive. And what he's able to do, this is a way of preserving his purchasing power over long periods of time and sort of using low interest rates to help himself. And anyone can do this at a certain level where you buy a house and you finance it with debt, as long as you buy it in a good location and you don't buy it at the peak of a big housing bubble. So I wanted to finish off with 2 other groups, or really one other group that benefits from inflation. Inflation is very good for cities that have a lot of debt, for states that have a lot of debt. California always runs these big budget deficits and funds it with debt. And then obviously we have sovereign debt. We have the United States. We have all these other big countries that are debtors. U.S. debt right now is $25 million. That's how many treasuries. That's the value of the treasuries that's out outstanding right now, 25 trillion, which is more than our national GDP, which is just 21 trillion. We obviously have a lot of unfunded liabilities as well. These are a form of debt. Social Security is a big one, and Medicare as well. So this says our unfunded liabilities are 147 trillion. So for governments that are highly indebted, inflation is a very good thing. And that's why I think this is how the U.S. will get out from under its debt, or will try to get out from under its debt. We're going to inflate. And that's why we have people like Neil Kashkari going on 60 Minutes and saying that the Fed has an infinite amount of money. They do have an infinite amount of money because they can print money. And so we have all these printer memes of the Fed printing money. What they do is they print this money, and by doing that, they cause inflation. They debase the US dollar. It doesn't purchase as much over long periods of time. And this is why investments like real estate, possibly stocks, gold, Bitcoin, scarce assets that the Fed cannot print. They cannot print gold. They cannot print Bitcoin. That's why these things do really well over time. And so when you have inflationary monetary policy, as we do now, you may have some short periods of deflation when aggregate demand drops, when everyone's staying at home, they're not buying anything, they're not traveling. But as you debase the US dollar, it basically ensures that there will be inflation. And the US government is incented to have inflation. It makes the nominal price of stocks go up. It helps people get out of debt by the price of their houses going up. It helps people who have a lot of student debt pay off their debt in devalued dollars. And so that's why we're in the sort of monetary regime that we're in now. And inflation is a virtual certainty going forward over the next 20 years. Hope you guys found this helpful. If you did, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Happy Mother's Day to all of you, and I'll see you in the next video.